Hello, everybody. I had the chance today to talk to Mary Harrington, author of Feminism Against Progress, which was published in 2023. Mary's analysis is that the feminist body of thought emerged in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, when men and women were both recalibrating their social roles, and that it had divided into the feminism of care, which is less classically feminist, and the feminism of freedom, which is what most people would identify with feminism now. We talked also about the transhumanist spin, let's say, on the feminism of freedom, discussing the invention of the birth control pill and its radical effects on individuals and society. Radical and in many ways perverse effects, because the pill was touted as the gateway to the hedonistic sexual utopian universe of ultimate equality and gratification of every whim, and actually turned very rapidly into universal abortion at the rate of 1 million a year in the United States, the radical destabilization of sexual relations between men and women, handing women over to their worst whims, and also to psychopathic men who are much more likely to engage in short-term sexual strategies, and then the general commodification of female sexuality, let's say on the pornography front, which occupies about 25% of internet traffic. Anyways, we weave our way through all of that, and so join us. So, Mary, you launched your book, Feminism Against Progress, in spring of 2023. So why don't you start by walking us through the book and the argument that you were making there?
Okay, well, it's a story in 3 parts, I guess. There's a past, a present, and a future. And really what I set out to do was answer a question which had become clear to me after I myself had a child, which was, why is it that motherhood is such a blind spot, it seems, in the women's movement? And as I read into that, pushing my buggy around the streets of small town England and reading as you do, I began to realize that it's not exactly that motherhood is a blind spot in the women's movement. And in fact, a great many feminist writers have tackled the question of motherhood one way or another. But somehow, whenever somebody sets out to make the case for mums within feminism, it ends up as the poor relation. It ends up being just left to one side and forgotten, and then somebody has to come up and say, well, what about mothers all over again? And then that gets forgotten again, and it keeps happening. And so I had this question: why? And to cut a very long story rather shorter, I came to as I delved into the question, I began to think that we were looking at the question of feminism wrong. I mean, it all started, Jordan, when I found myself having to answer the question: is it possible to be a feminist if you don't believe in progress? Really, and I realized I stopped believing in progress before I had a kid, and then when I had a kid, I realized I was still a feminist, but I had these questions about the women's movement, and I also still didn't believe, and I also no longer believed in progress. And when I put those pieces together, it didn't seem. It didn't seem obvious to me what the solution should be, because it's always been the case. Whenever I've said to somebody, "Well, I don't believe in progress," they say, "Haha, but do you want to go back to being without the vote? Would you like to be the property of your husband, perhaps? What about all of those other ways that life has changed for the better for women?" And I thought, well, this is kind of a head scratcher, because actually, these people kind of have a point. But on the other hand, here I am, feeling pretty lonely and pretty invisible in terms of the women's movement, pushing my buggy around small town England. And I feel as though, in some respects, things have got a whole lot better, and in other respects, they kind of haven't. And so how do I put together the picture of, progress on the one hand, feminism on the other, and try and make sense of where we are? And eventually I came to the conclusion that, yes, you can be a feminist if you don't believe in progress, but it depends a bit what you mean by feminism and a bit what you mean by progress. And so I embarked on this extended reread of the history of the women's movement, really in terms of technology, in terms as a phenomenon which began with the Industrial Revolution and with the transformations that came about in women's lives with the Industrial Revolution. and as a set of usually very legitimate and very justified responses to a wholesale disruption and upending and upheaval of what family life had hitherto more or less been. And I mean, of course, this varies a little bit from geography to geography and culture to culture. But I mean, I'm broadly writing about white bourgeois women in the English-speaking West because I mean that's where I stand. So it seems, and if we're honest, you know, the majority of the history of feminism is really Anglophone and bourgeois and white. So it seems a reasonable place to start. You know, not that none of that is to say that there are no other worthwhile perspectives, but this is the one that I have. So I decided to tell that story. And that's a story of women making a transition from broadly an agrarian subsistence life in the Middle Ages, where everybody worked, but they worked in the context of productive households. So really, the home was the basic unit of work in the pre-modern world. And women had there was women's work and there was men's work, but really, you know, outside very aristocratic households, everybody worked. And women's work just happened to take place with children underfoot. And it was generally of a kind which was compatible with having children underfoot. And none of this was really none of this was so much a kind of prescriptive thing about who ought to be doing what because of some set of moral characteristics, but more a pragmatic response to men and women's different physiologies and the needs of infant children, which are considerable, as you'll know as a parent. And so that was the pre-modern world. And then when the Industrial Revolution came along, it first removed fathers from the productive household and drained male workers away into factories, into offices, into other working environments elsewhere, increasingly. And then as time and then as time wore on, it also began to drain away women's work by producing as consumer products most of the goods which women had previously made at home. So, for example, textile making there's some sort of 20, 30, 40,000 years of that being classically women's work. There's an absolutely ancient history of weaving being women's work, because which makes sense in the context of an ordinary subsistence home, because you can lift a loom off the ground, so the baby doesn't get tangled up in it. It's social work which you can do with other people in company with children underfoot. And and anthropologists and historians have done extensive work and research into why it just makes sense from a material and a practical point of view for textile making to have been historically women's work. And yet textile making was one of the first domains to be industrialized. First with the spinning jenny, and then later on with mechanical looms. And there's a whole radical history in Britain in the early period of the Industrial Revolution when the textile makers were smashing the mechanical looms because they could see the end of their home-based subsistence life looming up in front of them in the form of these machines which had just taken the work from them. And the secondary effect of that was that women's work went away because you could just buy cloth. And that was a whole lot easier. And there are countless other examples of a similar dynamic taking place. And the upshot of all of this is that an increasing body of the work that women had previously done in the home simply went away, and and their role was, in the course of that, very much reduced. And so until far from being, as in a lot of pre-modern contexts, an equally economically active and socially active participant in the work of a productive home, they've become, as it were, a sort of chief consumer the bourgeois housewife is a kind of chief consumer in a private home. And I've drawn from Ivan Illich's 1980 book Gender in the book to understand the transition which Illich reads, and I agree with him, as really not a moment of empowerment, but as a significant loss of agency. And the point which, as Illich puts it, women make the transition from being active participants in a kind of ambiguous complementarity with men, where there's men's work and there's women's work, but everybody's working, to what Illich describes as economic sex, which is to say a condition of notional equality, but where in practice, because of our physiology and because of the allotted role given to women within a bourgeois private domestic sphere, women are in practice structurally disadvantaged. for Illich, sexism begins with the arrival of modernity. So this is really my history of the past, and women